Okay.
All right.
You see me and hear me?
We can see you and hear you. All right. So welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming. And I guess we can get started now. Our guest today is one of the most experienced and influential people in the entire blockchain industry. In 2013, he left a job in consulting to create the Bitcoin Education Project, a curriculum designed to illuminate the value of cryptocurrencies and decentralization. Shortly thereafter, alongside Vitalik Buterin, Gavin Wood, and others, he became a co-founder of Ethereum before departing the project in 2014. In 2015, he founded his most expansive project, IOHK, a company dedicated to researching and developing blockchain technology for private, public, and governmental applications. IOHK is most well known for Cardano, the world's single largest proof-of-stake blockchain with support for smart contracts, dApps, and staking, among other features. He has led the design, research, and development of Cardano since its inception. CS 1951L and Brown University is excited to welcome Mr. Charles Hoskinson.
Thank you so much for having me here.
Right, so would you like to kind of just maybe do a little talk about Cardano, your history with it, or do you want to go straight into questions? Or
Sure. So I'm kind of the accidental entrepreneur. I started with a love of monetary policy and a love of math and computer science. And I was also a bit of a political firebrand in my early days as part of the Ron Paul campaign. Where do you go when you like math, computer science, politics, and economics and monetary policy? You're pretty disenfranchised. There's really no degree program or route. And then somehow Bitcoin came around, and it was a really cool open source project that was launched in 2009. And I discovered it with the Slashdot revolution in 2010. There was on Slashdot. I said, oh, this Bitcoin thing is interesting. And I read the paper. So I said, I should mine some of those. And so I started mining with a CPU miner because we didn't have ASICs or FPGAs or GPU miners back then. It was just CPUs. I started going to Bitcoin Talk and other places. And there was, at that point, cool websites like BitNet where you could buy alpaca socks and all these things. I played around for a few years in that. And then right around 2013, after the Cypriot crisis, it became really clear that Bitcoin was not only here to stay, but it was its own economy. And I said, I should just do that full time. So I asked an old friend of mine, what should I do? And he said, well, Charles, those who cannot do, teach. I said, oh, that's good advice. So I created a free class that I released on Udemy called Bitcoin or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love Crypto. And I ended up getting over 70,000 students, and I got over 5,000 emails, and it gave me a great opportunity to get to know everybody in the business, from Roger Ver to Eric Voorhees to Andreas Antonopoulos and others. And through that, I met Anthony Diorio, and he asked me to join the Ethereum project. I was person number 5 in that setup. Didn't work out so well for me there, but I learned a lot along the way. And I said, you know what? It'd be really cool to actually build a company that builds blockchains for a living. So I started Input Output in 2015, and it was just me and a co-founder, and we grew it to a 600-person organization that's now in 50 countries. And the product we're known for is Cardano. We wrote 1 million lines of code, 131 academic papers, over 10,000 citations in the portfolio. And we also designed Cardano with some very advanced computer science techniques. In particular, we used Haskell as the programming language, which is a very unorthodox functional language to use for industrial stuff. And we did a lot of things like formal methods where we wrote specifications and actually proved the specifications are correct. It's commonly done in the aerospace industry, but it's really not done as a startup. So we kind of had to learn how to be formal methods engineers, and we had to learn how to be researchers, but then we also had to learn how to do user experience and, build a wallet, because we have 3 million people that use Cardano. So we say, well, how do you get this to work on many different platforms and in many different configurations? And how do you do UX UI engineering? And the last 6 years, that's what we've basically been figuring out as an organization. And we've learned everything from design thinking to things like the double diamond design process and so forth. So it's been a great education, I think, for not only myself, but all the executives involved. Also traveled over 70 countries, and we've built a very unique company where we do not only blockchain engineering, but we also do a lot of work in the enterprise sector and GovTech. So for example, we have a large portfolio of work in Africa. I travel often to places like Ethiopia and other countries like Burundi and Zanzibar, South Africa, Kenya, and so forth. And we look at things like microfinance, digital identity. In Ethiopia right now, we're deploying a project for 5 million students to do academic credentials on a blockchain. And actually, we're looking at extending that to bid on the national ID system for the country. We also build things like voting software, supply chain systems. In Wyoming, we deployed something called Beef Chain. It's the only USDA-approved blockchain infrastructure for monitoring cattle. So it's a pretty diverse portfolio, all things considered. And what really makes it special and fun is that we get to work with people everywhere, poor, rich, and everything in between, from big Fortune 250 companies like Dish, where we talk about how they can enter the 5G space and be a telecommunications giant in the United States, all the way down to a subsistence farmer in Kenya who's just trying to get a $50 to $100 loan to be able to build, to buy some fertilizer or to bring some crops to market. So it's a really cool industry in that respect. And I'd say the core of blockchain is just basically a trust engine. So the point of our industry is really that you have actors who don't know each other. They have competitive incentives to lie and cheat, but yet they have to find a way to work together for the good of an industry. We see this a lot in coalitions and consortia. You see this a lot in political systems where everybody has to play by a set of rules. And generally you say, okay, there's some organization or body like the BIS or SWIFT or something, and then unfortunately that pushes a lot of power to a central actor. Same for the internet with ICANN for domain names and these things. The point of blockchain is to get rid of those central actors of necessity and be able to establish a logic between different actors so that those actors can work well together for the benefit of the consumers of the system. Whether that be a medical record system or it be a voting system or a supply chain system, we all rely on trust in some way. And if we lack it, it's very difficult to do business in a global economy. So that's really how I spend my time these days, is any problem that involves trust, many actors, especially on a global basis, yet somehow they have to work together. We try to figure out a way to make that happen, and usually it involves the creation of bespoke protocols. It's a lot of science, and usually we can't borrow software, we have to write it ourselves. So a lot of hardcore engineering, in addition to the standard solutions engineering that one would do. But anyway, that's a brief introduction about me and what we do, and I'm happy to. These things are always fun when they're interactive, so I'd love to get to questions from you guys, the audience, and it'd be hopefully a good dialogue.
Yeah, so we have a few prepared questions, and then anyone in here is free to use the chat as well, and we should be pulling questions from there. This first question is from myself, and says, in computer science and blockchains especially, we often hear about the Gartner hype cycle, where when a technology is in its infancy, it draws massive attention and is lauded as the solution to every problem ever. After some time, it gains overly cynical critics who seek to discredit every possible use case, and eventually, as the technology develops, utilities settle somewhere in the middle here, often called the plateau of productivity. Where do you see blockchain technology currently as existing somewhere on this curve?
Well, geopolitical and macro events occur that either slow or speed up the need for things like blockchain technology. So generally speaking, if you live in a society that has high trust in institutions and very efficient institutions, you don't really see a need for blockchain technology. You're like, well, hey, everything's working really well. Why would we want to change it? When you live in a society where institutional trust is at a low point and those institutions are bureaucratic, inefficient, or corrupt, there's an enormous need for it. And what ends up happening is, even if you don't know you need blockchain technology, what you end up doing is you start building things that look like it. You say, oh, it needs to be resilient and decentralized, and we need to get rid of central actors. And you start following that exercise, and you say, oh, screw it, I'll just go get a blockchain. Kind of like The Simpsons, where Mr. Smithers didn't want somebody to upstage him when he was going on vacation, so he was looking for like an interim assistant who was not so good. And so he's entering a search query of incompetent, gross, and all this stuff. And then he said, oh, screw, I'll just go get Homer Simpson. Well, similarly, blockchain is like that. You know, as you start entering all your design requirements to build a system that kind of compensates for the fact that you have low institutional trust, you end up needing things like a Byzantine fault-tolerant consensus algorithm and cryptographic credentials and you know, power being pushed to the edges inside the system, as well as the resilience to standard impact. And that can be for both internal problems and external problems. So internal problems are things like we've lost legitimacy and pick your favorite institution, the voting systems or the media or whatever it might be, and we want to rebuild them in a way that somehow is can't lie to you instead of don't be evil, can't be evil. Surveillance economy is a great example of that. You know, a lot of people are Facebook users and say, oh, well, hang on, I don't know what they're doing with my data. I don't want to be a member of this thing unless I can put some constraints on them of where and how they can use that, which is why products like Brave, for example, exist, and they're growing by leaps and bounds. External threats could be infrastructure security. Recently, Russia invading Ukraine, the very first thing they did was use cyber attacks to take down the power grid and the ATMs and other parts of the infrastructure of Ukraine. So a lot of nation states are saying, well, how do we build infrastructure that look at it. It doesn't matter if you trust the institution to behave well externally or internally. So when you look at the Gartner hype cycle, it just depends on what question are you asking. If you're saying, well, this thing is going to replace central bank money, or this thing is somehow going to rebuild all of society and we're going to live in a crypto anarchistic utopia, that's not really going to take off anytime soon. But if instead you look at a particular institution or a particular area where things are failing and there's a strong demand for change, whether people admit it or not, I think we're actually accelerating towards adopting these types of systems. And that's why you see the market caps have gotten so high. Government subsidies are starting to really get apparent, and regulation is coming, which is a reflection of the legitimization of the industry as a whole.
All right, thank you. I think we have a few hands raised, so I'm not sure if you could maybe could unmute first if you have a question.
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. Charles, my name is Ben Friedjan. I'm a senior here at Brown. I'm a huge fan of yours. I watch every single one of your Q&As and everything. And, you know, I just want to say that you have a vision of how blockchain should be that I agree with. That it has to be focused on decentralization, security, and most importantly, you talk all the time about something that I don't hear a lot of other people talking about: governance. That how do you resolve disputes in the future, and is this going to be a 50-year, 100-year blockchain? Cardano's had a lot of success. There's also been chains that have a different view, kind of the move fast and break stuff view. You know, I think of Polygon and Solana and Phantom. And they have a different view of the world than you do and how the blockchain should be, where they're not very focused on decentralization or security and more about just getting to the use cases as fast as possible. When do you think, I agree with you, and I think that Cardano and some other layer ones that agree with you have a better plan and a better view of how the blockchain should be. When do you think the tipping point is going to be where everybody moves towards the chains that are focusing on security and are focusing on decentralization?
So first, thanks for the support. You know, why do people go to Brown over University of Phoenix or DeVry or any other place? I mean, it's like, well, Brown was founded, I think, like 1764 or something like that. There's a few hundred years of excellence in history there. You know, it's an Ivy League school, and there's a commitment at the university to do things in a way that not only build it well today, but build it well for the future. And so that degree you guys are going to get means something, and it helps your career and helps you be leaders. So I look at blockchain infrastructure the same way. It's ultimately a digital institution. And this is an institution, if it's credible, like Brown is, that people would actually entrust with things like their medical records, their financial history, their privacy, their academic credentials, all of these things. I go to governments all the time. I sat with the president of Burundi recently, the president of Zanzibar. We've met with probably more than a dozen heads of state over the last 24 months. In all those cases, they say, well, as a head of state, that person is ultimately responsible for the long-term welfare of his people or her people. And so the question is, well, what institutions should they build on top of something like Cardano or blockchain, where they have assurances that that's going to be good for them 50 years from now or 100 years from now? Now, you mentioned one of the most important things, and I'd say there are two that are super important and often not discussed. One is governance, and the other is inclusive accountability. So governance is basically, how the heck do you make changes? How the heck do you grow and evolve over time? Because there's some kids in the background. How do you evolve and change over time? That's a really hard one, because no one's ubiquitously happy with their government. I can't find a single person anywhere in the world, no matter what country I go to, I've been to more than 70 now, who says, you know what? We've never made a mistake. Everything's great. Every world leader is amazing and incredible. No, there's always a problem somewhere. There's always a debate, because we have, at sometimes, conflicting interests. The things that may be good for you are not necessarily good for me. The things that are good for Michael are not necessarily good for David. And so as a result, you have to have some sort of system to be able to, despite our differences, converge with consensus towards a legitimate outcome. And you can see a government that loses consent or legitimacy. Every time there's election, there's protest, there's violence. Every time a decision is made, there's a very radicalized minority, in some cases majority, that try to overturn that, and then you get inconsistency. Inclusive accountability is the other side of it, which is your ability personally to verify the things you're told. Okay, so for example, if you are sent a Bitcoin, one of the things I loved about Bitcoin was that I didn't trust a central server to tell me that the Bitcoin I've been sent is real and legitimate and hasn't been double spent. Instead, if I have a full copy of the blockchain, then what I'm able to do is I'm able to check algorithmically if it's been double spent and if those coins exist. And so the question is, what other things can you do? Let's think of a voting system. We currently in the United States and most democracies in the world have voting systems that when you vote, you can't actually verify if your vote's been counted and counted correctly. And we're told to just accept it. Well, you actually don't have to. You can build an e-voting system that when you vote, you can verify that your vote has been counted and counted correctly. But actually, more interestingly, the third property is the integrity of the election system as a whole. Wouldn't it be nice to know, and you could verify it yourself, that there are not more votes than people registered? This is the bedrock of democracy, and it's what gives legitimacy to the government. And so that's just an example of a system that lacks inclusive accountability. But you can look at it in anything. Use of funds, like a charity. How do you know they actually spent the money on refugees in some place, or instead of just buying private jets and yachts and going to expensive dinners and so forth? Wouldn't you like to have verifiable accounting? These types of things. So those are really the two bedrocks, I'd say, that a blockchain system requires if it's actually real. The problem is that these are super expensive properties to have in a very competitive environment, which is why there's so many blockchains and differences of opinion. It sounds good on the label to have inclusive accountability, but if that means that every single person has to have a copy of the full blockchain, what happens when your blockchain's a petabyte? Who has a copy of it? Google and the NSA. Pick which one you want to get it from. There's not many people that could sustain a data set that large. If your model of governance is that everybody has a voice, what happens when your system has 10 million people? How do you poll 10 million people? How do you talk to 10 million people? What governance system do you need for that? So this is a tremendous opportunity for students, graduate students, postdocs, business leaders, entrepreneurs to figure out how to move the trade-off window from the naive solutions of everybody just votes or everybody has to have a copy of blockchain to more elegant things like the use of snarks, for example, that enables you to preserve inclusive accountability because you just check a proof instead of the whole blockchain, but you get the same level of trust. Or different types of governance systems like liquid democracy, for example, where you can delegate your vote to a trusted person. And these are the kinds of experiments that we're currently conducting at Cardano. There are others like Tezos that are conducting equivalent experiments, and it's a very diverse industry. But what's really cool, especially from an academic perspective, is that there's an acceleration of velocity of multidisciplinary peer-reviewed papers with high citation counts coming out. When I first started in this industry professionally in 2013, you go to a cryptography conference like Crypto, and there'd be like two guys or gals that were writing papers on cryptocurrencies, and they were the strange weirdos in the corner and nobody talked to them. Now there's like whole sections and whole conferences that have been taken over by cryptocurrencies. And just in things like zero knowledge cryptography, for example, there's probably more than 2 or 3 dozen good publications per year that are coming out with high citation counts that are being passing the rigors of peer review. In terms of multidisciplinary work, algorithmic law, a lot of really cool law and policy stuff that's coming out, a lot of game theory and social choice theory, algorithmic game theory and mechanism design. Really revolutionary papers are being written out of Oxford and Cambridge. Even some people at Brown, I think, are doing this work. So it's really remarkable to see that people have shown up. Unfortunately, competitive pressures are sometimes preventing those papers from being turned into actual protocols, because the market seems to right now be rewarding time to market, throughput, and other things over philosophy. But I think that's a temporary set of concerns, especially as we see broad scale adoption in institutions and governments that really care more about what actually it does instead of vanity metrics like market cap and these types of things. Next question.
I think we'll take another question that's been queued. It's by Aaron Wang, who asks, how does your recent investment in Colossal relate to the work you're doing at Cardano? And what is your decision-making process when evaluating the viability of a project or investment? And you can maybe briefly explain what Colossal is for those who aren't aware.
So Colossal is a really special, interesting, once-in-a-lifetime venture. Every now and then you just see something. It's like when, what's his name, John Doerr saw Google come across his desk. He's like, yeah, these guys are going to get this done. So it started by Ben Land, George Church. Ben's a serial entrepreneur, and George is a professor at Harvard. And I've been following George's work for a very long time. In fact, I remember talking to Peter Thiel years ago, and he financed some of the work, and I was going to give George some money, and then Ben got to him and said, let's start a company. So George is, he's a polymath, but he's an expert in synthetic biology, genetics, and other things, and he's probably got 250,000 citations. So in the academic world, professor at Harvard with that kind of citation count, you're basically God mode. And his whole area is that he really wants to bring back extinct animals. He's been focused for the last 20 years in particular on the woolly mammoth. So he went to all these tar pits and he extracted from their bone marrow their genome, and he systematically went through and studied the mammoth genome and compared it to the elephant genome. And he basically figured out what makes a mammoth a mammoth. So Ben came to him and said, well, why don't we create a company that is going to focus on de-extinction? So they came to me, and I gave them $1 million, and they've raised now $70 million. It's the first investment I've ever been in where Paris Hilton is also in the investment with me, in addition to all the regular VCs and so forth. It's kind of a strange group of bedfellows. But what's so special about it is they have an all-star team of just synthetic biologists, ethicists, and others, and they have a great roadmap over the next 5 years to de-extinct the mammoth. So they should be able to clone them by 2025, and there's a 22-month gestation period. They're going to use Asian elephants as surrogates and try 10 of them to begin with. And I also own a ranch. I have 11,000 acres over in Wyoming, and we found mammoth bones on it. So hopefully I'll be able to actually be the guy who actually raises the mammoths in addition to just being a passive investor. But it actually opens up a very interesting philosophical question. So there are deep ethics questions related to de-extinction, and we all, wow, woolly mammoth, but what about other animals? What about designer organisms? There's also a whole line of research they're doing with artificial womb technology and the use cases of that. Well, this is where blockchain technology is really interesting, because you need some sort of transnational commons to store the DNA. Unfortunately, under US law as it stands right now, because of Monsanto and other organizations, the way that GMO works, if you create an organism, all of the derivations of it, you own the intellectual property of. So at the moment, if they bring back the mammoth, for the rest of time, the genetics of the mammoth belong to one company forever. That's not exactly a desirable outcome from an ethical viewpoint, a market viewpoint, and so forth. So the question is, where do you go from there? Well, what if we find a way to treat the DNA, the intellectual property, as an asset that can live in the digital commons and put that on a blockchain? So a vertebrate de-extinction database that's blockchain-based, that's ubiquitously accessible, is one area we're looking. They also want to do an NFT line. That's very low-hanging fruit. But there's a litany of things. Also, prioritization of the extinction. They have the giant sloth, the woolly rhino, the dodo, dozens of animals. So after the mammoth, where do you go? Well, maybe you crowdfund it, and whichever one raises the most capital, it's sudden death. That's the one that they pursue. So there's a lot of very interesting questions there, from transfer of intellectual property to where a vertebrate DNA database would be to non-fungible token assets. There's also going to be a very, very restricted supply chain. In particular, we're seeing in the state of Wyoming, if we can pass, because we've passed 26 laws for cryptocurrencies, can we create some laws specifically for de-extinction and come up with a way to regulate the de-extinction process? This is a loophole under US law at the moment. Nobody really imagined we'd be resurrecting mammoths anytime soon. So now that that's here, and there's a tangible path to it with great research out of Harvard, it's now a very real legal question of what are the terms and conditions of that. So it's very important that you track them. It's very important that you have these things tightly monitored and controlled. So there's been a lot of questions about our work with beef chain, where we track and trace cattle for supply chain. Could we track and trace de-extincted animals and their entire life cycle for a litany of purposes? So you asked another question, which is, how do I assess ventures for investability? I have several venture capital funds that I've started, one of the most prominent of which is the C Fund. We're just about ready to launch our Africa Fund, the A Fund. The C Fund, we started last year, and we got a great return on it. We put 10 million in, and we got a 408% return in a single year. So being a novice in VC, I felt really good about that. But that's mostly focused in the Cardano space, and we're looking at traditional DeFi and other such things. And there, it's just standard venture capital. You look at the team, you look at the strategy, you look at the level of maturity of the product, the market fit. You're looking usually for a minimum viable commercial signal, and then you just kind of make a decision. You also look at what capabilities for capital syndication exist. Colossal, we were oversubscribed. They were looking to raise 18 million. By the time I put money in, they were already on their Series A, and they raised another, I think, 60 million or something like that on top of it. And everybody wanted to throw money in, from people in Hollywood to traditional VCs to celebrities and so forth, because it's just, it's one of those lifetime things that you do. So capital syndication also really does help, especially if it's not too dilutive. Next question.
David, if you'd like to ask your question. In that case, I guess I can ask a question from the chat by Aryan, who asks, how do we get over regulations around blockchains from corrupt governments who are afraid of decentralization? And how do you see blockchains being integrated into the legal system?
I was once young like you guys, and now I'm getting a little older. I'm not quite old yet. I'm 34, but the white hair is starting to come in, and God, it's not as easy as it used to be. When I was young, I was like, these damn regulators, I hate everything about them. And now that I've been in the industry for 8 years and seen all the madness and chicanery and nastiness of it, there is a place and purpose for consumer protection. Last year, there's $10.5 billion of loss and theft just because of DeFi hacks and problems. The exchanges do very nefarious things. I got into a very famous fight with an exchange that shall remain nameless because they listed BitConnect, and I called them out on it. And they refused to list data because of that for over 3 years. So there's a lot of nastiness that occurs when you have a completely unregulated marketplace. So it's less of a question of no regulation or bad regulation. It's more of a question of, can we use the technology to self-regulate, algorithmically enforced regulation? So one of the things that's so attractive about smart contracts is that you don't need a custodian anymore. Instead of saying, here's all this stuff, we have to trust you to hold on to it, just have the blockchain hold on to it. And then everybody can verify it, and they know that the terms and conditions are immutable. They're not going to change on you. So stable coins, algorithmically generated stable coins, are an area where that makes sense, and you suddenly don't have the tether problem, for example. So one of the areas that we've been doing most of our research in for the regulatory side is automation of KYC and AML in things like contingent settlement and confidential transactions, which are anonymous on the outside but have disclosure capabilities to certain actors, and basically building regulation in that way where you can have a sensible pattern that has consumer protection built in and also requires transparency, and where it is nice and removes information asymmetries, but doesn't slow down the merchant. If you're a bank or a regulated financial institution, for example, and you have a KYC AML, so that's know your customer or anti-money laundering, generally a big part of your budget, your net profit is diminished by the need for compliance, and then they turn you into like a pathological pack rat where you have to hold on to all your customers' data for 7 years. And so you're a data warehouse. You don't want to be, but you have to be. It would be a lot better to live in a world where the settlement is compliance. So if you send a transaction to the exchange, if it settles, it means you're in full compliance with the law. And if the auditor comes, the regulator comes, you show them the audit trail and you're done. You don't have a compliance officer anymore. This is the world I'd like to get to. And I think there's a lot of different things that have to be done. And there's some, for those of you who want to go to graduate school and study hard computer science problems, there's some phenomenal things in natural language processing and just dealing with the ambiguity of legalese that are unresolved and need to be resolved if we want to move towards algorithmic regulation. The set of things that smart contracts can do compared to the set of things a traditional legal contract can do is very small. And to broaden that set of things, you need advancements in that field. So it's a little bit of a mix and match. The other thing is what regulatory structures do you use? I started Ethereum in Switzerland. We worked with FINMA, and we set up a self-regulatory organization, and we kind of pioneered using this Stiftung model for cryptocurrency foundations and other things. And we advanced Swiss law. We did the same in Wyoming, where we got a bunch of laws passed. But in general, I think we need to move towards an SRO model because things change so quickly. You need a thing that can change as quickly. And instead of asset-based regulation, functional regulation. The problem with crypto is it's like a financial stem cell. So it could be anything. It could be a commodity. It could be a currency. It could be a stock. You know, it could be a non-fungible asset like representing a painting. One thing can be all those things. So it's a mistake to take that one thing and then put it into a category and say, well, it lives in that category. Because in some cases, you actually run into contradictory regulation. For example, the Securities Exchange Commission right now is saying XRP is a security. But then FinCEN is saying it's a currency and regulating them that way. Well, hang on. If you're regulated one way, you have to comply with the Bank Secrecy Act, in which case you have to keep certain things private. If you're regulated another way, you actually have disclosures and transparency you have to have. So the same asset has contradictory regulation where they have to, it's like the Schrodinger's cat. Instead of being alive and dead, it's like it has to be both secret and public at the same time. It's a pretty bizarre notion, and it's quite unfortunate, but that's what you get into when you look at asset-based regulation. If you're functional, then you say we're going to regulate it at the time of use based on how it's been used. If you use it like a security, then you have a securities issue. If you use it like a currency, then you have that. So I think some combination of what can we do algorithmically, and that's a research question as much as it is an engineering question, and gradually broaden that because that's transnational, universal, and great for everybody. What requires fast-paced rulemaking that needs to change often, that's the SRO, the self-regulatory organization model, and then ultimately moving from an asset-based to a functional regulatory model and developing standards there. And then the meta properties of what principles do you want to maintain. There is an unfortunate conflation where there are three demands that a regulator has. One stems around consumer protection. The other stems around market stability, so that's macro and microprudential policy. And third is geopolitical. So that's anti-terrorist financing, sanctions, these types of things. These are not necessarily unified. It is entirely possible that you can do a phenomenal job with consumer protection, but you're actually harming your sanctions and geopolitics side. It's entirely possible you can do a great job with consumer protection, but by doing that, you actually are creating market instabilities that, not detected, would lead to another 2008 financial crisis. So the regulator has a really hard job because they have to balance all of these different demands. And things that may be good for the global system may actually be harmful from a competitive viewpoint for a nation state. And that's what makes this such a complicated job, and why there are so many regulators floating around, and why they oftentimes are at conflict with each other. Like the CFTC is at conflict with the SEC, for example.
Great. David, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Charles, for taking the time to join. I guess my question revolves around, you mentioned the diversity of your portfolio and a lot of acceleration in terms of crypto adoption. In some sense, it seems like the meta problem here is prioritization in terms of what business problems you're supporting in terms of the products you already have, products or availability, functionality on Cardano, and also what things you want to support in the future. My question is, to what extent can you use quantitative data? Can you look at indexing the blockchain, whether that's Cardano or seeing what's working on Ethereum and other smart contracts protocols. Like, to what extent can you do that to inform these prioritizations? And then that doesn't seem like it always would work. So what are maybe the things to look out for? You don't want to be entirely quantitative here. You want to look at some of the qualitative metrics as well. So what are the dangers of over prioritizing the metrics of the blockchain when you're trying to do that?
Yeah, it's the quintessential business problem if you ever go and get an MBA. It's like the data-driven decision-making versus the domain expertise and qualitative decision-making versus your gut feeling versus imitation. I can't help but remember McDonald's versus Burger King. It might be an apocryphal story, but it's one I like telling, so screw it. McDonald's has these great data people, and they sit around all day long, and they try to say, like, what's the ideal location to put a franchise? And they spend all this time crunching the numbers, and they look at everything, and they know everything about everybody. They know 26-year-old Catholic women in Pittsburgh. They travel this much, and they do this. So obviously, this is the perfect place to put the franchise. So they find a location. And what Burger King does is they just build a Burger King next to the McDonald's. Sometimes you can be a trendsetter and make data-driven decision-making, and other times you can just see where the market's moving. And they say those are the three I's: the innovators, the imitators, and the idiots. And oftentimes the imitators are the ones who win, not the innovators, because while you innovate, you have to trailblaze, and that's an added expense, and you get covered with arrows and scars, and it slows you down. The imitator has the luxury of hindsight, and so they can come to market without the sins of the past and use less resources, especially in marketplaces that don't really respect network effects. We tend to think that once you've gotten a network effect or a monopoly, you're invincible, but that oftentimes is not actually true, especially in technology. So in many cases, the imitators usually win. The problem is, if you're too late, you're on the other side, the idiot side, and it's really hard to know if you're an imitator or an idiot. It's really hard to know. So on our side, with Cardano, we tend to look at three things that we need to get done this year and next year. And one is commercial comparability, two is sustainability, and three is self-determination. So commercial comparability is just very metric driven. You try, and unfortunately we don't have metrics within our organization to measure throughput, nor to measure throughput at the price of reduction or increase of decentralization. There's two metrics you have to measure there. And on the decentralization, we're going to create an index at Edinburgh, University of Edinburgh, called the EDI, the Edinburgh Decentralization Index. We've written several papers on it, but it's a bear of an academic problem. But we're now leaving the lab and moving to reality, and we'll actually be able to create a number and say, okay, this blockchain is this number of decentralization, this one's this number. The other metric we need is throughput, because what does performance look like? You'll often hear in this space things like transactions per second. What the hell does that mean? Because if we're an extended UTXO system, that's a very different accounting model from an accounts-based system. It's like parallel versus serial. So one transaction there is very different from one transaction here. As just an example, Ergo, another extended UTXO-based system, they had a single transaction with 5,000 outputs. To simulate that one transaction on Ergo in Ethereum would require probably more than 1,000 to 500 transactions. So are they apples to apples? No, they're apples to oranges. The good news is you can always in business argue by analogy. So when I was growing up, I remember the processor wars between AMD and Intel. I was like, okay, AMD is a gigahertz. Now Intel's 1.2 gigahertz, and now AMD is 1.3 gigahertz. So there was the gigahertz wars. And then at some point they started saying, well, gigahertz don't matter. There's a different notion of performance for a processor or a GPU. So 3D Mark was invented and these other things, because you had chips that were 2 gigahertz that were outperforming 3.8 gigahertz chips, like Centrino to the Intel Prescott series. So they created a synthetic benchmark for these types of things. So that's what needs to be done in our industry, is to create a synthetic benchmark and then relate that benchmark to decentralization. And the question is, what is the maximum throughput your system is capable of before you start sacrificing decentralization? So you're looking for an optimization problem effectively there. So commercial comparability is getting those metrics in place, looking at where Solana sits, Ethereum sits, next generation things like F2, Polkadot, Tezos, EOS, and so forth. And you just measure those things and you say, okay, what do we feel is a reasonable benchmark for decentralization? Maybe it's Bitcoin. We'll start there. And then say, what is the maximum throughput achievable And getting to that number, I think, is the first thing I'd like to do in terms of commercial comparability. It's very metric driven. Sustainability is saying that your system should be able to give the customer the same level of utility, usability, and operating cost as it grows. You don't want a situation that your system, when you go from 100,000 to 1 million to 10 million to 100 million, the quality of service goes down, the cost of operation goes up. It's not a scalable protocol. BitTorrent is a great example of a hyper-scalable protocol. If you guys are downloading Pee-wee's Playhouse, like the 3 people downloading it will give it to you in 48 hours. If you're downloading the last season of Game, well, you know, it's terrible. Season 6 of Game of Thrones, you'll get it really quickly, right? Because a lot of people are participating in that. So the more people who participate, the better the quality of service. It's a truly scalable protocol, which is why BitTorrent carries a meaningful amount of traffic of the internet. So comparably, you need a cryptocurrency protocol that when transactions happen, no matter if you have 1 million customers, 1 billion, it's going to keep up with them and the system won't collapse and become unusable, as Ethereum is right now with the high gas fees, or Bitcoin has been historically during the block size wars. Finally, in self-determination, the system should be able to converge to a decision about its philosophy and roadmap. The system needs to have the capability of being able to make decisions. I can come up with the Cardano 2025 roadmap, but by golly, how do we know it's legitimate? Because Charles said so. That's not very decentralized. No, you need a voting system. You need a system that's able to say, hey, yes, we agree, or no, we don't agree, or yes, we agree for 9 out of 10, but that 10th one, screw you. We're not going to wear purple hats on Tuesday. So that's where we sit. And then there's a meta question of commercialization of it. Where can we chase? Well, our marketplaces we play in are a lot in the real-fi markets. So my definition, Charles Hoskinson's definition, IO's definition of success is, can I give a loan to a farmer in Kenya and have that be a much better experience than traditional MFI? And can I get the remittance cost from 15% to a penny? That's what I look for, because if I can get there, it'll change the world. It'll really improve their lifestyle. But that's my goal. If it's a truly decentralized system, SundaySwap and Meld and Occam, the other DEXs building, I have a very different definition. Cody, the Israeli company doing JED, the stablecoin, and AdaPay will have a different definition. So it's really a question of satisfiability of the collective. Does your system have enough commercial comparability and competitiveness about it that the people who are building on it are comfortable with that? Do they have the right development experience, the right libraries? You know, do they have the right time to market? Is the software life cycle looking good? And also, are you doing right by your principles? So the things that are built, are they certified? Meaning that they're audited and they're verified and the software is high quality and there's low probability of hacks? Or are they very dangerous applications, like what we see on Polygon and Ethereum and other places, where every day you read another hack or so forth? So that's how I make the decision now, but I'm not qualified to make that decision for 3 million people. No one is. You need a governance structure that it collects the wisdom and voices of the collective, and then you can run those decisions through, and like a crucible, you burn your way down to eventually a strategy and plan that makes sense. And that's the self-determination component. And that's what we're chasing for the next 24 months.
Thank you.
Michael.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you for coming and everything. I love asking this question. I feel like you have such a deep passion for blockchain and technology behind it. And like, especially for me, I don't know what I want to do within the field of CS. It's so large. You know, I feel like it's so big now. So what about blockchain like motivates you to enjoy the work in it and gets you motivated and excited to work in the field every day, if that makes sense?
Well, the only way you get to an elite level in life is not focusing on the consequences of being elite, but rather focusing on a problem and being so obsessed with it that you must become elite to solve it. So if you're a great blockchain entrepreneur, you probably get rich, great, but that's a byproduct. So when I look at Cardano and I look at the things we had to solve, we had 3 major innovations we had to solve. We had to solve a completely new way of doing consensus protocols, like the whole science of proof of stake. Like books will be written now by what we've done. This is as meaningful as, I think, Lamport's paper in the 60s on clocks. It's a big deal. We've written 12 papers over, I think, 2,000, 3,000, actually more than that, I think 4,000 citations with that paper portfolio, looking at GKL and Ouroboros and so forth. Really remarkable. You see the progress there. So we had to solve that problem if we had any chance of hell at having a commercially comparable and sustainable system. Okay, so we did it. Second, we had to have a different programming model, because the way smart contracts are written is really nasty and bad. And you don't want global state in a distributed system. That's like the biggest sin in the world. You want local state. Imagine, having one global variable for your entire program, and any part of the program at any time can change it. Is like non-deterministic hell. You'll never be able to figure out why your system is failing. So you need local state. So we had to create extended UTXO, and then we wanted to do software verification. So we had to somehow drag Haskell, a functional language, into the cryptocurrency space and make it meaningful and sufficiently expressive to be able to do interesting things. Again, this was not an easy problem. We brought Phil Wadler, and he created Haskell. He's, prominent academic at Edinburgh. And, he spent 4 years of his career, the twilight of his career, along with a dozen other PL experts, designing new languages and new techniques, and wrote a lot of great papers. And then there's the governance problem, Catalyst, all these other things. Like, how the hell do you engage millions of people and get them to solve it? But all those problems I had to solve in order to be able to get to a point where I could wake up and redo my TED Talk from 2014, where I said, hey, we're going to go save the developing world, and we're going to be able to give loans to people and all this stuff. Those were promises made, but those aren't reality. Those are promises. And if you want to make that eventually true, what you have to do is you have to do the work. And so I've been obsessed with that moment, to go back, redo the TED Talk, and be able to deliver on the promises I made. Digital identity that's decentralized and self-sovereign. Digital reputation systems so people can build credit scores and central actors can't stop them. No friction in the movement of value between borders, so no middlemen of necessity to take money out of the transaction. Stable currencies that are more stable than the national currencies with high liquidity, so they're treated as good as cash in a lending circle. Accomplishing that required 8 years of research and development, 131 papers, 1 million lines of code, and I can't tell you how much pain and hardship. And by the way, massive amounts of criticism. My God, it's like, you talk to some people and it's like, I had an opportunity to go back in time and kill Hitler and didn't do it. I mean, it's like the crazy shit that people say is out of this world. But you just have to just put your nose in the grindstone and keep doing it. No amount of money in the world, no amount of fame and prestige in the world is ever going to convince you that's a good idea. You have to be obsessed with that. So you ask about computer science. Should you pursue a PhD or an advanced degree? Well, do it if there's something you're genuinely, legitimately interested in, to the extent that you're prepared to endure the suffering of working 100 hours a week and sacrificing your social life and not going out on that fun date and these types of things, and missing birthdays. I missed 3 funerals. 3 of my 4 grandparents died. I was out of country traveling, doing something. I missed a lot of anniversaries. I missed a lot of events because I was chasing this dream with an obsession. So if you can find that obsession, that passion, then you'll do very well. You'll achieve eliteness as a byproduct of chasing it, because you're willing to put the time and effort in to get there. If you don't have that, that's fine, that's okay. But then just do the eat, pray, love thing and go find your passion, whatever that might be. And it might coincide with where you're at right now. It might be woodworking in Himalayas while meditating. Who knows? Everybody gets to decide. I never thought I'd be involved in resurrecting the woolly mammoth. That wasn't exactly like high on my list of things I assumed I was going to get around to, but now that I am. And by the way, shit like that opens up things you never even think were possible. For example, the same guy I worked with on the Mammoth Project, he said, Charles, we have all this research about making plants glow in the dark. Why don't we commercialize that? Anna, I said, Ben, that's so fucking cool. Let's do it. And so now we're doing it. And so we're figuring out, like, okay, how do you take jellyfish genes and firefly stuff and so on, put it in the plants, and their trees glow in the dark? Same technology platform, doing all the synthetic bio to resurrect the mammoth gives you a platform to do that in software, and then just push a button and boom, you have plants that do that. So that's the other cool part about following the passion, is it creates all these branches from it, and it gets you involved in things you never thought you would. Chasing Cardano means I now talk about e-voting. I never thought I would. Chasing Cardano means that we think about algorithmic stablecoins and what makes a good national currency. I never thought I would do something like that. Sustainability, scalable protocols, these types of things, it forces you to think a lot about user experience. I never thought I'd be a UX, UI guy. I mean, closest I ever came there was reading a book called Don't Make Me Think. And I thought it was real smart. I read a UI book. Oh yeah, real smart. Now I'm getting into like the cognitive neuroscience. We're just about to kick off some research with Carnegie Mellon University and their UX group, because these are some of the best guys in the world for it. And we're going to do this whole experiment of, can we find a better way to recover crypto wallets than 24 keywords that has a higher degree of memorability and a higher degree of entropy than the 24 keywords, because we want to create a consumer product. That obsession compels you to follow all the different branches in that respect. And I can't tell that for you, but that's your job to figure out.
Thank you. So inspirational and influential. Thank you so much.
All right.
All right. Any closing thoughts or questions?
Yeah. Again, I just, on behalf of CS 1951 Ellen Brown, I want to thank you for coming. It's been a great talk.
Good luck, everybody. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Charles.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming, everyone.